Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session on using narratives to communicate climate risk. My name is Ruben Ng from the LRF Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk. I also have another appointment at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So narratives, as you know, shape the 10 poles of our society, right? Oh, sorry, I was too... I'm told to take off my mask, okay. The rules keep changing, so narratives, as you know, shape the tempos of our society, from elections to the economy, right? We have new fields called narrative economics. And so narratives are very important, even how we frame it. So I'm a psychologist by training. It is really interesting to see how framing could influence human behavior. So I'm a data scientist by training as well. So in a previous career, I used to be with a consulting company trying to understand data pain points to come up with data strategy. I remember in some parts of Asia when we talked about defining the problem, right? Because it's important to define the problem before we think about the solution. But in some governments in Asia, when we talk about defining the problem, nobody said anything. Then I was wondering why, and they said, oh, because we don't have problems. Okay, then I realized we cannot frame it as a problem. We need to talk about what is your aspiration, how can we make it better, okay? The other experience I had about the importance of narratives and framing is, it must have been 8 years ago now when I was with this consulting company. We were given a session to talk to this CEO of a big conglomerate about artificial intelligence. I remember we spent a few weeks to prepare for the presentation, and after 10 minutes, this guy just told us, I'm really not into this artificial stuff. We're all about natural. And he just walked out of the room. Then I realized that how you frame it matters. So next time, in future presentations, we didn't call it artificial intelligence anymore. We just call it AI. So you can project whatever you think A is, right? It could be augmented intelligence. It could be awesome intelligence, whatever. So, at those points, I realized that sometimes the framing, the narratives matter a lot rather. And today we're going to focus on climate risk. I do a lot of work on looking at historical narratives. And if we look at in the 1800s, the word climate and risk don't happen together. It's only in the recent 40, 50 years that climate and risk happen together a lot more, and also climate action. But I'll talk less. We have experts with us today. We have Professor Matthew Snyder-Meyerson, Professor Song Chao Lee, and if Professor Pontus Wallin is joining us online. So maybe let me just let our experts introduce themselves before jumping into their presentation. Matt, please, maybe you want to begin?
You want me to just introduce myself? Hi, I'm Matthew Schneider-Meyerson. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Yale and US College. So I work mostly on climate fiction, sort of applying both humanistic and social scientific methodologies to look at the influence of climate change literature on readers, particularly in the United States. And I also do work on reproductive climate concerns and choices.
Oh, hi. I'm Zhao Li Song, associate professor at the US Business School. So I'm in the Department of Management Organization. So my major areas in leadership, management, genomics, AI, so on and so forth. So I happen to be here because I have a study on sci-fi movies. And then I find it's interesting, might be related to climate risk. And I check it and find it indeed. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Maybe it's a great time now to have Professor Chao to give his talk.
Okay, so today's talk is titled Climate Risk in Sci-Fi Movies. So I just mentioned, I happen to have a study on sci-fi movies and find it's relevant to today's thing. So on the right corner, you can see that's a paper published in Future. So I published with my PhD student, Alessandro Fragnani, who happened to be a futurist. So we analyzed 140 sci-fi movies And the reason for us to look into sci-fi movies, we find out the sci-fi movies is a way to think about how humans think about the future. So we are interested in how humans think about the future. So we use future scenario analysis, analyze those 140 sci-fi movies, and extract some scenarios. Okay, so that's how we analyze those movies. And what come out 6 scenario archetypes. So we summarize all those sci-fi movies into 6 scenario archetypes. Let me just explain one by one. The first one we call the growth and decay. Basically, this is a portrait of the future scenario where economical and technology advanced, very economic technology advanced. However, there is a contrasting deterioration of environment. So a lot of cyberpunk movies you will find out belong to this category. So one of the earliest sci-fi movies called Metropolis, a German movie and released in 1927. So pretty much set the stage for this line of sci-fi movie. One of the most famous one is Blade Runner, 1982. Avatar, Ready Player One. So those are examples of sci-fi movies belongs to the growth and decay. The next category is called Threats and New Hopes. So in those type of movies, you can see Earth is under threat or danger. So there will be heroes to find ways to save the Earth. So you can see the sample movies like 2012, Interstellar, Downsizing, The Day After Tomorrow. So those sci-fi movies demonstrate how humans are in danger and how it has been saved. A third category we call the waste worlds. So this is a dystopian scenario portraying a destroyed environment. So sample movies like Mad Max, Waterworld, or Wall-E. Okay, so the fourth type we call the powers that be. Basically, this type of movies portray a population under the control of a restrictive regime. So basically, the government take full control of the population. In such kind of scenario, typically you'll find that humans under threat, lack of resources or sort of like that. So the government take advantage about that situation and further restrict the freedom of a human being. The fifth type is called disarray. So in those movies, you can see a society in a state of disorder. So sample movies like the Idiocracy, Children of Men, and Dread. Okay. The last one we called inversion, basically portray a world turned upside down. For example, The Quiet Place, After Earth, Planet of Apes. You can say aliens or animals take control and humans under control. So I find out those scenarios, some of those scenarios are more relevant to climate change, some are less. The most relevant one is the threat of new hopes. So in those type of sci-fi movies, it tends to portray all kinds of risks. And one major type is climate and environment risks. Also, the growth and decay, waste worlds or disarray, those types tends to portray the environmental risks. So among those risks being portrayed for human future in those sci-fi movies, here I just gave a list. The first one, alien invasion, right? So you find an alien come from outside and invade human race and put human society under risk. The second type is the restrictive regime. The government is over control. Third one is the corporate monopoly. Okay, this is since the Metropolis 1927. This one corporate have monopoly the society has been very salient portrayed in sci-fi movies. The next one is science and technologies out of human control. For example, AI, robotics, and genetics. So I study genomics and management interface. So almost uniformly, I just observe All sci-fi movies portraying genomics on the negative side, no positive one. I have never encountered a single movie portray a positive effect of genomics. So another category is called disease, contagious disease, for example. So I have another study summarize 30 realistic pandemic movies. Okay, so I find that disease tends to be considered a risk for human race. Another one is war, particularly nuclear war. Okay, the last one I think that's environmental threats. So at least all those threats, including flood, storm, earthquake, volcano eruption, heat, cold, pollution, and so on and so forth. Right. So you can see the environmental and climate risk are very saliently portrayed in sci-fi movies. So it's relevant to today's topic. So here are some examples. This is the Blade Runner 2049. I think this is a remake of the first one, 1982. So you can see this is outskirt of the city. You can see outside of the city, it is abandoned. No trees, no grass. It's a sandstorm. It's not suitable for human habitation. So this is clearly a portray deteriorated environment. So I will consider this is relevant to climate risk. The second one is the year 2012, right? 2012. So portray a flood. This is a flood situation, the flood of Himalaya mountain. So you can see this is very salient climate risk. Another one, this is Interstellar. Okay, so in this movie, the solar flare basically destroy our agriculture. So Earth is no longer habitable for human race. So human race has to find another place, another home for us to live. So you can see that's clearly climate risk. The next one is Waterworld. Basically, this is a utopian situation. It's after North and South Pole melted down, and the water just cover all lands. So that's climate risk, right? So this four movies just show you, those screenshots show you sci-fi movies portray climate risk very, very vividly. Okay, so it has a huge impact on human mind, on the audience. So in terms of causes of climate risk in sci-fi movies, I list 4 of those. The first one is the geological changes. For example, magnetic field change, Earth pole flip, earthquake, and so on and so forth. So sample movies like The Core, The Day After Tomorrow, vividly demonstrate geological changes. Those geological changes tend to be very, very dramatic. In a very short period of time, Earth gone through dramatic change that influence our climate. The second one is cosmic change. So like a sun, solar flare, expanding sun, Earthworld, like Interstellar, Hell, The War, The Wandering Earth. Those movies demonstrate those cosmic changes. A third one is nuclear war. But this one, this type of causes tends to be portrayed in 1970s, 1980s. After 1990, so less demonstration of this type of cause. So sample movies, The Bad Sitting Room, The Sacrifice. Those are UK movies. The last one is climate change experimental technology, like a Snowpiercer or Geostorm. They just demonstrate, for some reason, we have such a substantial technology, like a satellite that can change the weather, but it's more functional or being controlled by some malicious person. Okay. So then that leads to dramatic climate change. However, a lot of sci-fi movies do not point out causes. They don't explain. This is just given. Okay, and most causes explained tends to be very dramatic. In a very short period of time, whole Earth will go through upside down. Okay, so nothing we have experienced on Earth. This is very, very dramatic. Well, I just noticed few on fossil fuel consumption. Almost no, I have never encountered a sci-fi movie on fossil fuel consumption. We know this is facts, right? But no sci-fi movies on that cause. That's interesting. So the last slide, I just summarize the limitations of sci-fi movies, what I observed in explaining climate change. So the first one, I find out sci-fi movies more on drama, less on science and facts. But we should not blame sci-fi movie, right? So makers. It is a drama, so they seek for dramatic effects. In a short period of time, matter of 2 hours, so you experience a tension. So without a dramatic effect, people will just leave. So they will catch your attention by that dramatic effects. However, science and facts tends to be cold and less dramatic. So it's not so suitable to be portrayed in a dramatic fashion. However, some movies like Interstellar has been appraised for its scientific rigor. Another movie like Contagion, it is being considered best pandemic movie. So that movie maker consulted scientific community very well. Okay, so we can see there is still room for scientists and movie makers to collaborate and work together to make sensible facts to deliver to audience. Second one, I think as I explained, sci-fi movies more on the effects, climate risk effects, rather than causes. So most sci-fi movies set climate change as a stage without further explanation. Okay, I think this should be rectified in future sci-fi movies. It's better to pinpoint the causes. A third one, in terms of corporations, because I'm in the business school, so I interact with business, interact with corporates, right? So my observation of corporations, they tend to focus on CSR, corporate social responsibility, but none of those sci-fi movies have ever mentioned of CSR. So you always see evil corporations, evil company, evil bosses, right? Have you ever encountered very big-hearted bosses in sci-fi movies? Probably never. Well, so this is a distortion of facts, right? And we know companies play a major role in counter climate change. They play a big role. How we can get them involved in this narrative, right, in a positive way. So this is something I think we need to push movie makers to think. So we can see the cause, why they have that such kind of tradition. If you look at the Metropolis released in 1927, so that movie pretty much set the stage, set the tradition. Okay, about sci-fi movies always portray evil companies. Okay, I think movie making industry has to break from its tradition. Think about the alternative scenarios, portray positive influence of corporations. So last but not least, sci-fi movies always portray heroes, not common citizens. But we know this is a fact. Climate change and will influence all of us. And the way for us to move forward to really fight climate change is for all citizens on Earth to work together. Okay, thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlie. I'm so envious because you're watching movies for research. I think that's the most wonderful thing. Okay, maybe let's welcome Matt to give his talk.
Thanks for that, and thanks to IPER for organizing the session and this conference and inviting us. So I'm going to be talking mostly about literature, climate fiction, but I thought I would just say something at the beginning about the importance of narratives. You know, narratives are how humans make sense of the world, right? As scientists, as rational people, as people with masters and doctorates, we tend to focus a lot on facts, but that's not how most people make sense of things, and that's not even how we make sense of things. And so narratives are not just sci-fi films or climate fiction, they're really everything, right? And so one of the exercises I have my undergraduate students do, you know, when I make this kind of claim and they are a little dubious, is to spend a week and really write down every single narrative they're exposed to, right? Every pop song they overhear as they're walking around the mall, every ad they're exposed to as they're watching something on YouTube, every Netflix movie, really everything that they hear, even the sort of narratives that their friends are telling when they speak to them, which really get to the point that even the way we make sense of our own lives is through narratives, right? So the way that we sort of are imitating fiction, imitating film, as we think of ourselves as sort of the main character in our lives, is also demonstrating the power of narratives. And therefore, I think narratives and media have a really critical role to play in addressing climate change, and why I'm glad we're doing this session today. So speaking of fiction in particular, climate fiction has become a major trend in literature around the world. It first sort of came to general attention around 2013 after the publication of some major books, such as Barbara Kingsolver's book Flight Behavior. And at that time, it was kind of a cute fad. At the time, there wasn't the same sort of sense of immediacy around climate change, the sense that climate change is a sort of near and present and existential danger. And from then, it's really moved outside of sort of the genre category of bookstores, and has become present in almost every novel. And at this point in 2021, you'd really have to say that any novel that doesn't include climate change in one way or another is a work of fantasy or is a work of historical fiction, sadly. And so however you're defining climate fiction, there are now thousands of popular novels in every language that touch on climate change, and hundreds of novels that really center it in their plot, almost as if it were, in fact, a major character. And from a communication perspective, sort of you might ask, why look at fiction, right? Films tend to be watched a lot more frequently. Ads are things that we can't avoid every day of our lives, sadly. And so there are two reasons that I tend to look at fiction. First, I think it's true that fiction is not as popular as other forms of communication, in particular films and television. But they tend to require a lot more prolonged engagement. So the average person requires around 10 to 15 hours to read a novel. And of course, films today tend to be about 90 minutes for most films. And given that the persuasive potential, the persuasive power of most media, research shows, tends to be sort of mediated by transportation into the narrative and identification with the main characters, it makes sense that more transportation and more identification, which you get through a much longer exposure, would sort of give you even more impact. Second, novels tend to allow for more information than other forms of narrative, since they're obviously incredibly text-heavy. And since the contemporary novel, which has kind of broadly become a kind of postmodern pastiche, allows for so many different forms of communication. So novels can convey affect and emotion. They can convey information. They can convey the kinds of behavioral changes that we'd like to see. And they can also model political engagement, which I think is absolutely critical at this point in time for communication. And this creates the possibility for a real variety of modes of conveying different forms of risk and the kinds of responses that readers can or perhaps ought to engage in response. So with that sort of short introduction, I'm going to talk about 3 of the studies that I've done on climate fiction. And these are 3 of the only studies that have been done. There's a ton of sort of research from humanists, from eco-critics about environmental literature or sort of environmental perspectives on literature, but this is not really an area that environmental communication scholars have really looked into in much detail to this point in time. The first study that I conducted on this question, a qualitative survey with 19 different American or British climate fiction novels, which was published in 2018, confirmed many of the common claims of authors and critics, which people have been making in public for almost a decade now about climate fiction. So I found that climate fiction does remind concerned readers of the gravity of the climate crisis, while impelling them to consider its impacts on both human and non-human life. Novels helped, or even at times forced, readers to imagine different possible futures and focus their attention on aspects of the climate and the biodiversity crisis that had previously been unknown to them. For many readers, this was accomplished through the setting of many works of climate fiction, just like dystopic films, which was in the distant future. And by placing these stories in the future, storytellers are able to successfully illuminate the long-term consequences of our actions, or lack thereof. However, I also found that climate fiction is unlikely to reach most climate deniers or skeptics because they'll never pick up these books. The readers of climate fiction tend to be younger, more liberal, and more concerned about climate change than non-readers. And this is, in fact, what we might expect, because most novels that center environmental issues, as is often the case with films too, tend to announce their subject and therefore their assumptions about the existence, causation, and significance of climate change in their synopses, which are visible on their book covers or their back covers and retailers' websites. And as such, it seems unlikely that people who deny climate change or are simply apathetic about it are unlikely to ever encounter these sorts of texts. As such, there's sort of a lesson here, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and that's that to have the maximum impact on readers or perhaps viewers who would otherwise not be thinking about climate change, climate narratives should not be marketing themselves as such. So then the question becomes, how significant is this influence? And how long does it last? An experiment I conducted with researchers at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, published in 2020, tested the impact of 2 climate fiction short stories on the attitudes and beliefs of readers that are in the concerned and cautious categories of the 6 Americas of climate change. And the 2 stories represented different flavors of climate fiction. One of them was In-Flight Entertainment by the British author Helen Simpson, which is a realist short story concerning the psychological and moral dimensions of the denial, avoidance, and acceptance of the gravity and climate change set in the present. The second story was Paolo Bacigalupi's The Tamarisk Hunter, which is a kind of quintessential cautionary tale set in the present. Placing the reader in a dystopic, drought-ridden, climate-changed future. Somewhat surprisingly, these 2 very different stories had similar effects on readers, who were assigned to 2 groups at random. As compared to the control group, readers of the climate stories became more concerned about climate change harming them personally and harming future generations, rated it as a higher priority, and expressed belief that climate change would lead to more droughts, more poverty, and more refugees than they had before reading these stories. While the effects were small to medium in size, which is what you might expect with a simple short story, the conclusion was clear: the stories worked. Unfortunately, their influence was short-lived. A month later, the effects we observed had diminished to statistical non-significance. While disappointing, this result shouldn't be taken as evidence that the impact of all climate fiction or all climate narratives is transient. Research indicates that repeated exposures to a narrative and reinforcement from other media and to social influences can lead to compounding effects, and that the influence of a solitary message tends to dissipate, but repeated messages can cause the effects to stick. And the influence that we observed from a single exposure to a short story probably represents a lower limit of the actual effects of climate fiction on readers. In the real world, of course, most people tend to read novels, not short stories, and they're exposed to repeated narratives across all kinds of media. But since any work of climate fiction or film or song, game, or nonfiction article is likely to have a small and perhaps not permanent effect on most individuals, I think what we really need is not these kind of extraordinary anomalies, but a constant stream of climate narratives. We need all authors, all filmmakers, and all cultural workers to include climate messages in their narratives. This should be accomplished not just by authors and other cultural workers taking their own initiative, as many are doing, but by governments sponsoring collaborations between cultural producers and scholars. Consider it a form of conscious cultural adaptation, or perhaps cultural engineering. So I'll conclude by discussing the third study that I conducted so far, or published so far, which is on the risks of creative climate communication. It was published last year in the journal ISLE, and it's on one of Bacigalupi's other novels, which is called The Water Knife, on American readers. And so the reason that I focused on this author, Paolo Bacigalupi, is that he's one of the most popular American authors of environmental literature in recent decades. And his book, The Water Knife, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what it's about, because I'm sure most people haven't picked it up, it concerns some really critical themes for everyone in this room today: climate migration, climate injustice, and the potential for socio-ecological collapse. And like most climate fiction, it really serves as a cautionary tale for what might happen if we don't take action in the near future. To give, it's set in the few decades in the American Southwest, where climate change has led to permanent drought, and individual states, battling quite literally, militarily, for access to water, have closed their borders for non-residents. The titular character is Angel Velasquez, a ruthless water knife who ensures the flow of water to his bosses in Las Vegas. Most of the novel is set in Phoenix, in Arizona, which is in the midst of collapsing amidst water scarcity, an influx of climate migrants from nearby Texas, corruption, and gang warfare, as Angel, the protagonist, and other regional players are attempting to track down ancient water rights that could shift the balance of water access and power in the Southwest. So that was a lot of information. But readers of The Water Knife probably remember its style as much as its plot or characters. The novel effectively places a pulpy, hard-boiled, and often quite violent thriller in a climate-changed future. It keeps the pages turning through a central whodunit, shifting allegiances, and a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. It's a pretty engaging book if you ever want to pick something up. As a result, the book does have the potential to reach a broad audience, and I found that it did seem to attract more conservative and moderate Americans than other climate fiction. And importantly, that it seems to lead them to become more aware of environmental injustice and to empathize with Latino characters who are climate migrants, much as the author intended. But the conspiratorial trust no one vibe of the book, as a retail worker from Fort Worth described it in my survey, seemed to backfire. Some readers view the suffering of poor people and climate refugees and the comparative safety, health, and comfort of elites living in beautiful, safe, ecologically self-sufficient buildings as an illustration of the fact that climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities, which they found troubling given their desire for equality and justice. However, just as many readers of this book responded to this depiction with a sense of gratitude for the comfortable lives they enjoy. For example, a cashier from Erie, Pennsylvania wrote, "The lesson I took from reading this book was to appreciate the things you have now, even the small things that do not seem to mean much. Every day I use and waste water like it's nothing, without thinking about the people on the planet who do not have access to clean water." So good so far, right? But he continued, "I think about what those people would do to me to have access to the water I have access to for just 1 hour, and that thought frightens me." The fact that this reader described himself as very liberal demonstrates that the author's visceral portrayal of desperate climate migrants engaged in a graphically violent struggle for survival can have unintended consequences, since even liberal readers might not empathize with climate migrants, but fear them. This is why authors, filmmakers, and climate communicators need to be careful about how they portray cautionary climate futures, around migration in particular. Not all climate fiction or film will have a progressive impact on readers. Books like The Water Knife might unintentionally motivate support for what Naomi Klein has referred to as climate barbarism, allowing the citizens of less wealthy, post-colonial, and equatorial nations to suffer, or even eco-fascism. This is, of course, a very real threat that we face today. Environmental and climate concern has been associated with liberal and leftists in recent decades, especially in the US, but historically there has been no shortage of conservatives and fascists who have claimed to act on behalf of nature. While it's clear from my surveys and experiments and those of others that climate fiction can and should play an important role in warning us of the dangers of inaction, helping to shift perception, attitudes, and beliefs, and modeling effective actions, it's logical that if literature or film or any other medium can do all of these wonderful things, it can also have a negative impact on people. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Matt, for the tour de force of different ideas that you have presented, you know, within fiction and your studies. It's really incredible. Actually, there are quite a few questions that have come in from our audience. But maybe before that, let's go to Pontus, who is now live and joining us from Europe, who will give a presentation. Hi, Pontus. How are you?
Hi, everyone. I am fine, but yeah, sorry for the mix-up with time. We have winter time in Sweden. It might be that, so we're 1 hour after. I'll just show my presentation here. How much time do I have? Is there a change now when I was late in?
Maybe about 10 minutes.
Okay. So my name is Pontus Wallin. I work at the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute with a Swedish authority, and I'm here to show you the climate adaptation game. And the climate adaptation, that is how to adapt society to the effects of climate change. So it is not that we should reduce emissions, because that is it's necessary, but it is not the same thing as adapting as climate adaptation. And you can see on the very simplified illustration on the right that we have like different types of measures for adapting society to climate change. And if we would like reduce emissions, then we instead would target like rising sea levels, for example, in order to make them stop rising. But adapting society to the effects of climate change, and rising sea levels are one of those effects, is to adapt how we live, for example, as you can see from the illustration. And by doing this climate adaptation, then we can avoid many of those risks. So there's both like economic risks and health risks as well. So just a very short introduction on adaptation. And this is how the game looks. You can see the link on top of this page as well. It will follow through the whole presentation in case you want to write it down or something. This is the setting that we have chosen. And this town is called Weatherton. And in this narrative, you play a climate adaptation coordinator. So you coordinate how this town, Weatherton, should adapt when the climate is changing. But you're also in charge of a lot of other things, because we've made this game very complex.
Pontus, Pontus, so sorry to interrupt. We are actually not seeing your slides moving as you speak. I wonder whether it's something you can control on your side.
Okay, let's see. Okay, I'll put it down, and I'll use it in this mode instead. Sorry for doing this. Yeah. Okay, so this was the first adaptation slide. That was the illustration I talked about with the house that can be moved in order to avoid the rising sea levels. And okay, my animation doesn't work. I'll just remove this. This is how the game looks. This is the town. It's called Weatherton, and we've made this game pretty complex, but also very simplified, because we have included not just climate change and climate adaptation in the game, but also sustainable development goals, even though we have simplified and just put 5 of the 17 goals into this game. And we also put in like economic aspects and health aspects to this game. So there's a vast variety of different challenges that is fit into the game, which the coordinator had to tackle throughout the game. And the game is played out on an 80-year like time perspective. As you can see, we start in year 2020 and we finish off in year 2100. And so this is the setting. Remember this when I go through my other slides, because I will not be able to show you the actual game because it takes too much time. But what is this game then? It is a free online game about climate adaptation. So it's easily accessible on our webpage and everyone can play it. And there's also one simplified, even more simplified version in the making, but this one is up on the web right now. And we developed it a few years back, and it's been launched 2 years ago now. But apart from being just a video game, it is also a communication tool for all different kinds of educators, such as teachers. And through this like playful platform, if I go back here, this is a pretty playful environment, but there's different serious challenges built into the game, such as the SDGs and also climate change and adaptation. So the players, they get a chance to think and take decisions about really complex challenges, but in a playful environment. And in order to make it more attractive to teachers and other educators, we made it an education package. So there's printable material for leading a workshop, which you can choose to have like a role play. There are 7 different kinds of roles And the different roles, there are different interest organizations in this town of Weatherton. So you divide your whole group in 7 different groups, and they have different missions throughout the game, and there's discussions, and there's a voting when the class or the group needs to take decisions on what type of adaptation measures they should choose. So there's a democratic element built into the game as well, if you choose to have this kind of workshop. And we've done this with a lot of people. And on the picture, you can see that, or maybe you can't see, but on the picture, there's both politicians and students in a mixed workshop, which was really fun. Great discussions when the politicians had to step out of their political party role and into a role play instead. Very good discussions. So we try to make the obstacles for using this game very small. So that's why we made this education package instead. At the end of the workshop, or at the end of your playing round, it can look like this. Then you have, instead of just 2 different missions, which were showed on the map in the first page, we have now 7 different missions, and that's all missions that there is throughout the game. For every missions, you have like 4 different alternatives on what to do, and that is what the group is voting about if you have a workshop. And by every vote and for every decision you take, you affect something else in the game, so everything is connected. So if you, for example, choose to like save the drinking water, which is one of the challenges built into the game, then you affect also the sustainable development goals in a positive or a negative manner. And you also affect the town's economy and how many lives that can be saved or not saved throughout the game. And after that, you get a summary and you get sort of like a grade. You can get maximum 5 stars from this. And there's a lot of more information you get out from the summary as well at the end on what you did good and what you could have done better. And also throughout the game, you can pretty much like hover with your mouse pointer on everything and get a lot of information about climate change adaptation, and how one certain measure would affect something else, and how, for example, if you want to save the drinking water, and then you can get like a calculation on how much money it would save you if there was a drought or a heat wave, maybe. So it's very complex, like calculations at the background of this game, but it looks very simple. And that's kind of the point with it. And why did we do this then? Well, we wanted to, as we are a meteorological and hydrological and also a climatological institute of Sweden, then we want to communicate our climate scenarios, because they show the risk for different types of extreme weathers that can, the amounts and the increase of extreme weather, it changes throughout time in the different climate scenarios. So when you start the game, you can choose between different difficulty levels. So the hard difficulty level is represented by a climate scenario in which we humans have let out more greenhouse gases than in the other difficulty levels. And the different climate scenarios have complex names such as RCP 4.5 or RCP 8.5, but then this is just like hard, medium, or easy difficulty levels. And you can see them down here on this page. So on the right, you have the hard level, and in that box chart, the risks for the different types of extreme weather, which are droughts, heat wave, and heavy rain. They are the different extreme weathers are color coded, and the risk it rises with time throughout the game. And by this, just because you choose one difficulty level, it's not the same every playing round, because we have a chance generator built into the game. So by this, we can also show the difference between weather and climate. So in one playing round, maybe you are struck by 3 heat waves in the first time step, while in the next you don't get a heat wave at all. And that's to show the difference between weather and climate. Serious gaming stands out. It's easy to create interest and to put a narrative on. It leads to deeper discussions, and we also think by having all these different challenges in the game, we can enhance the students' analytical abilities. We made this for students primarily and their teachers, because it was also a communication tool for them. But we have received interest from climate adaptation professionals, scientists from communication, risk, and climate, and also politicians. And these are some of the learnings. I think I will round up here. I think my time is out, but the fourth point there, simplify everything, that's probably the main learning from this experience. So it took like 2 years to develop this, which is a long time, and to simplify everything, that was the most important learning. Thank you for listening, and sorry for being late.
Thank you so much, Pontus. Okay, we received quite a few questions. So in the interest of time, we have about 5 to 7 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collate the questions for each speaker. I'm going to ask them at once. Then I'm going to give you the floor to answer them. So for Zhao Li, I was really taken in by your points on getting scientists and movie makers to work more closely together. I guess it's probably exciting for scientists. I'm not sure it's very exciting for movie makers to work with scientists. But how would you make this happen? Okay. Okay, then maybe to some questions, you can have a moment to think about it. Then questions for Matt. Matt, there's this question from Krutika. Among the currently available climate fiction, personally, what would be your top 3 books and other means of communication? I guess you could have another career on book recommendation. And the other question from Camille is, if you were to make a narrative of your own, how would you convey the problem to viewers or readers without awakening the barbarism that you mentioned earlier? And there is another question, this time it's from me. If you were to, how would you make the case for fiction compared to documentary? How would you convince somebody to make a work of fiction rather than documentary? And Pontus, this question is for you. Your game is really exciting, but what's the future that you envision for this particular game? How would you scale it? Okay, and maybe let's start with Zhao Li for your thoughts, then Matt, and then Pontus.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So I have 3 answers for this in terms of how scientists can work with movie makers. The first one, I think movie making industry is kind of unique. They work with their own ideology. As I mentioned, like Metropolis, a movie in 1927, has a huge influence, almost 100 years until now. You still can see the narratives continue. They have their traditions, they have their ways to follow, right? So, however, you'll find that the movie making industry is kind of, they also respond to the social pressure or the audience expectation at that particular time point, right? So, at certain era, so there are certain urgent issues. So the movie tends to reflect that timely issue. So in our paper we explain this as we consider the movies tends to be very responsive to the social request. So movie makers will be sensitive to what happened around in the world. So they will reflect. I think more recently, like climate change has get into the movies, particularly in sci-fi movies, more vividly than before. As I mentioned, like Blade Runner, the first one, 1982, you don't see too much climate change or the salient way, but now the remake, Blade Runner 2049, there you'll see the climate change become very, very salient. Okay, so I think this is a response to the social pressure, right? So all the audience expectation. The second, the movie making industry is also using different ways to communicate with other communities, like science community. For example, there is a sci-fi movie society. they have a conference. So my student, Alex, last year went to one, I think in Thailand, okay. So he met movie makers, okay, writers. So futurists interact with the movie making personnel in those conferences. So this is a second way, I think, you'll find a communication, how science can collaborate with movie making. A third mechanism you'll find, right now the movies tends to be rated, right? So the audience have something to see. So you can see in different platforms, movies get a score. Those good movies tends to get good scores. And we know Interstellar and Contagion, those sci-fi movies get very high, good scores. And as I mentioned, those two movies are good examples of how movie making industry collaborate with the scientific community to make more sensible sci-fi movies. Okay, so those are three ways I think scientists can work with movie makers.
Let's see, my top three recommendations here. I think three that are particularly important and unique and compelling would be Wu Mingyi's The Man with the Compound Eyes, which is a Taiwanese novel. Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which has gotten a lot of attention recently. And I think Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. All of these books are kind of important in sort of both showing the problem, which is obviously important, but also showing the way that individuals can move from ignorance to education to behavioral change and even to political engagement. So I think for me, that's one of the critical things that we need to be doing a lot more of as storytellers, is to sort of show how people can take action in effective and meaningful ways. And also just sort of noting that we've been discussing authors and filmmakers, but the reality, of course, is that cultural production is the result of a massive infrastructure, right? That includes government subsidies, that includes editors and executive producers, that includes reviewers and bloggers and all these things. And so everyone can sort of play a role here by trying to sort of advance, climate and environmental messaging in a progressive direction. So it's really not just that authors or filmmakers are failing, but I think that we're all failing to really recognize the gravity of the situation and respond to it. What was the third question? Was there a third? Yeah, so the case for fiction versus documentary, I think this is sometimes the way it's framed, and I think it's a mistake in framing. Ultimately, there's no silver bullet to the problem of climate change, as we all know in this room. I think what we need instead is a kind of silver buckshot approach, as has been put. So there are people who prefer documentaries and love them. There are people who love film and others who love, pop songs. I think we need to be reaching these different audiences in every sort of medium and every genre within that medium.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Pontus.
Yes, you asked about the future of this the climate adaptation game, and that would be to adapt the game to different regional settings, because the climate scenarios that we have used in this game is that's a Swedish setting, and also the town Weatherton, it's based on a Swedish model. So instead, we would like to develop, we would like to downscale climate scenarios to other countries and other regions in the world, and also like build up different towns which is more suitable in other countries. That would be very interesting, and I think we would get closer and get the people's ears in other countries with this. That's one thing, and the other thing is to reduce the amount of information in the game and make it more simple in order to make students with maybe lesser reading skills to play the game as well, because we think that everyone should be able to play the game. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Pontus. Okay, so I guess time flies when we are having fun, or at least for me. So I'll just do a quick conclusion, then we'll wrap up. So I have actually taken quite a few pages of notes from these brilliant presentations. There are some learning points that I've taken away. The first is the importance of unconventional collaborations. I think, as Charlie mentioned, the collaboration between scientists and movie makers, who would have thought, right? Sorry, when I'm talking about movie makers, somebody's just calling me, but let me just turn that off. Unconventional collaborations and alignment, right? Alignment between unconventional collaborations. The other one is really the importance of connecting the dots through different tools, right? I can just imagine, right? If we all collaborate, we can write a book of fiction. Maybe Matt can write a book of fiction. Zhao Li can produce a movie, and Pontus can create a game, right? And these will be all fantastic teaching tools that we can put out. So it's really connecting the dots, building a basket of tools that we could use together, and going beyond the value chain of just one tool. The other thing I thought that was really interesting, Matt, from your presentation was this ability for fiction to tackle adjacent issues. Because it's very boring, right, to have a book with just about climate risk. So it could be climate racism, you know, we tackle a few issues together, and you know, fiction or movies could do that to make to better reflect the reality of things, because things are really interconnected. And the other thing I thought you mentioned that was brilliant is really different types or rather different types for different stripes, right? Some prefer documentary, some prefer fiction. I think it's to put the content out there, and most importantly, speak to them, not just to minds but also to hearts. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.